Comparison of different trials within the one individual or comparison between individuals is very useful for understanding the underlying kinetics of how the athlete produces a particular movement, for example, a jump. So we'll open a file now. Which is a previously recorded counter movement jump. And here we see the force total and then the left and right force. If we right click on the graph, we pull up an additional graph menu. And from here, we can open a comparison file. We'll open up a comparison counter movement jump. This is from a different athlete. And we can see that the additional data is now displayed. Click to hide the left and right force and then zoom in on the jump. From here we can use these cursor keys to shift the data and align the two trials in time. I will align the two trials at the actual takeoff point. From here, we can see quite clearly the difference between these two jumpers. By way of background, the first trial that we opened was from a highly explosive jump athlete. And you see that their typical curve here, where the force increases to a peak here. There is a slight dip at this point, but it's fairly modest. The second graph is from a non-jump athlete, still a very highly trained individual, but they are not an athlete for which lower leg explosive power is a key requirement. And we see a couple of key features here. First off, they initiate the jump here, and so the jump takes a lot longer. Their actual loading phase here through the eccentric is much longer than the more powerful lower body athlete. We also observe, and we'll zoom in a little bit closer, we also observe that the unweighting is much greater for the more explosive athlete. You can see that their decrease in force down to almost 200 newtons here as compared to the less explosive athlete. You'll also note that the peak in force is lower, but also this dip in force production here, which is much more pronounced. Another indication of the lower ability for explosive force in this athlete. So let's now examine the velocity profiles of these two athletes. We won't display the force at this time, just to make the graphs clearer. And we'll just zoom in a little bit closer on the actual jump itself. So we see that in terms of the unloading here, the actual eccentric velocity is not too different between the two, but you will see that the concentric velocity, the peak velocity here, is much higher for this athlete, the more explosive athlete. What you'll also note is we have a nice acceleration right through until quite late in the jump here, whereas the less explosive athlete, we have good acceleration through this part of the early phase. In particular, the early phase of the concentric portion, once we pass through zero here. But then it begins to level off, and the acceleration is not as great through this section. We can also compare the power output between the two athletes and the power profiles. Again, this is very instructive. We see that the less explosive athlete has a much more gradual negative power curve here. They do drop to a similar level of negative power of about minus 1500 watts. And then the less powerful athlete, you can see again this characteristic dip in power here, leading to a much lower peak power. Here we see peak power of around 3,300 watts compared to the more explosive athlete peaking at 4,850 watts. We can also compare the left and right force output for these two athletes. We'll switch off the overall total force to make it clearer to make the comparison, and we can see here the differences in force production for the left and right sides for these two athletes. Interestingly, here we see that for the two athletes, comparing the two left traces, there's very little difference in terms of peak force here, although a considerable dip during the concentric phase. But for comparison of the right legs, you see a much greater difference between the two. This was indicative of some prior injury, existing injury in the comparison athlete of their right leg, and we see the difference here, which is a nice comparison in terms of their force capability output for the right leg. This has been a comparison between two athletes in a counter movement jump. However, the same analysis can be applied to a very wide range of other performances, including both dynamic ballistic movements as well as isometric.